I'm going to guess you love to read, and you know the kind of story you like to read. So I'm going to tell you a story about how that book became the kind of book you like. Every society on this planet tells itself stories, but that doesn't mean that the form of the storytelling is natural. It's not. It's crafted. We, for example, take for granted that we can pick up a novel. It's a type of story. We know what kind of story it is. The truth is that that is an invention. It happened at a certain time, a certain place, in a certain language, and came out of other genres. So the genre of the novel came out of, for example, poetry. It's not that telling a story that is an epic journey is an unusual thing. In poetry, Homer, for example, from the Greeks, told that kind of a story, but it was told in verse instead of in sentences. Drama is also an older genre, and it had dialogue in it, chorus, stage instructions. But it was not written as a story in sentences, and that was the innovation of prose narrative and eventually the novel as a genre. And a genre is a collection of stories that we see as the same kind of story, and it arises from individual writers reading each other and thinking, oh, that's an interesting element. I think I might experiment with that a little bit. I'll put new clothes on it, I'll dress it up in a slightly different way and experiment with it, and thereby extend that element into a pattern. Or they might resist a certain element and turn it on its head and see what that looks like, and thereby invent new things by doing that. So the elements that were used over and over ended up becoming patterns and training the readers as to what kind of a story was being told here. So the oldest genre in prose narrative is romance. And I don't mean small r romance that is a love story specifically, but as a capital R romance that is a great big improbable adventure. It has idealized characters that are larger than life, that are heroes and heroines that roam its landscapes. This is not like the Greek myths that had gods duking it out with each other with their own intentions. These are now humans, and we find them in settings that are likely quite remote or enchanted, because a dash of the supernatural is not an unlikely thing in a romance. So as writers wrote these stories and stole, borrowed, were inspired by elements from each other's stories, patterns emerged. And one element of that pattern of the ancient romance was that the setting was generally an indeterminate past and place. This is your classic once upon a time in a land far away. It didn't have to be Toronto on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. That kind of realism is not what this kind of story was. And we recognize that, what kind of a story it is, right from the opening when the setting is being established. Another element is the characters in the story have great mobility, that they can be kidnapped and taken halfway across the world. Interesting in a time when it would take a very long time to do that, but they can go over there, and even more so, their friends can show up 15 minutes later. So that is not an unusual aspect of this kind of a story. Another element of this pattern is incorruptible heroes and heroines. They are good to the core, and there's no infidelity that you're going to have to worry about. They are good people or bad people in these stories, and the heroes and heroines can be depended on. Another element is that if there is a connection between land and people, that means something good is going on. This is the basis for the pastoral, which means that if anyone is tilling the soil, they're good. If they're animal husbandry, if they're taking care of animals, that also indicates good. And sheep, for some reason, would be the favorite animal to be taken care of. Another element of this kind of pattern is great social mobility. So this is the Cinderella syndrome, where you can rocket from rags to riches, you can go from riches back to rags, and back again if necessary. Interesting too that this comes from a time when there was no social mobility. You were a serf farming a land that was owned by an aristocrat, and there was nothing in between. This was before there was ever a middle class. So it's in the imagination that this kind of mobility is common. Another and final element of this kind of pattern is that the story itself, the action itself, is generally set in motion by a quest. So somebody's going off to look for something that's important, and will likely have to jump through some hoops with trials and tribulations to be able to accomplish that. So the people who are reading these stories are people who can read, and at this time that wasn't very many people, and they were aristocrats. You had church people who would read in Latin, church types of things. They weren't the people who were going to be reading this kind of story. The aristocrats were, and they wanted to see their own issues dramatized in a story. So you have what they care about, what they're afraid of, what they have desires for. All those sorts of things are played out in these stories to be meaningful to them. And this was not in terms of a market doing this. The person who was writing it, who could also read, would have been of that bunch of people. So this is the kind of sort of exploration of a story that was done. Now, an example of this kind of early romance was a story called Arcadia, written in the late 1500s by Sidney Phillip. Now, just to place this in historical context, Geoffrey Chaucer was the first poet of English, and he was in the late 1400s. So this is 100 years later. You have writers who are writing in sentences, in prose narrative, and beginning to develop the elements of the ancient narrative, or the ancient romance, which was the first genre to come out of the older genres of poetry and drama. The setting in this story is characteristically natural, where it's at the summer solstice, so it's described in a seasonal way rather than a specific date or time. There are shepherds in it, and we know that the shepherds are good, and they are good. But we also have the more Hellenistic Greek elements of aggressiveness in it. So you have pirates, you have kidnappings, you have rapes and violence and disguises. The main characters are aristocrats, and there is love at first sight in this story, and it is a love at first sight that goes right down to the ground and is permanent. You have two sisters who are in love with their respective lovers, and you have an evil wannabe mother-in-law who wants to pressure one of the sisters into marrying her son. She's not going to do that because she's already in love with somebody else, but the pressure gets pretty darn intense, to the point where the evil mother-in-law makes the sister watch her sister's head get cut off, trying to persuade her to marry her son. So it gets pretty intense. But we know that the love is never going to be compromised that she has. Also interesting too, what developed in this kind of story is the association of beauty in a woman, external beauty in a woman, with goodness inside. So there are many tropes that developed about, the rosy cheeks and cherry lips and all of this sort of thing, that were metaphors for the goodness of her character. And in the 1600s, you had Shakespeare already making fun of this kind of a trope in one of his sonnets, where he says, "My mistress is nothing like the sun," and he describes all her features, and they're nothing like the ways that it had been described in these kinds of stories. And his point is that it doesn't matter what she looks like on the outside, I love her for what's on the inside. Which is interesting to think about in our present day, because it might be that plastic surgery has made us suspicious about the relationship of the outside to the inside. And sort of the mean girl idea that no matter how perfect you look on the outside, it's hiding something that's not so great on the inside. But back in this story and at these times, what was being developed and experimented with is how to describe the outside of a woman who was good and pure inside. So needless to say, the sister never betrays her love. A subject is a good one in an ancient romance if it's erotic wishes being carried out. So if you have one of the main characters being in love with somebody or wanting love, that means that's good about that person. The badness comes in if there's a motivation of avarice or ambition in a character. That means that they're up to no good. If it's an individual agent, the knight going off to accomplish whatever he needs to do, that's indicative of good. If it's an agent of an institution, like the Sheriff of Nottingham coming and doing the work of some evil prince or king or whatever, that's indicative of bad. Mobility means things are going well. If you can hop on a horse and ride off into the sunset, this is a good thing. Impediments to mobility, inevitably bad. If there are kidnappings, if you're in a Rapunzel in a tower, if you're thrown into some kind of a restriction, that means that there's evil afoot. Also, the nobility of purpose shows what kind of a character you are. If you are going to do something that's noble, then you're good. But if you're conforming to somebody else's agenda and you're doing what you're told, that means inevitably something bad's going on. It might be, I'm assuming most of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride. If you haven't seen it for a while or you haven't seen it at all, it would be really good to go back to take a look at it, because they throw everything plus the kitchen sink into this movie that is an element of the ancient romance. And we will recognize it because we have been trained to recognize this kind of a story. So there are stock characters. There's Princess Buttercup, who is as beautiful as she is pure, and she has been forced by evil Prince Humperdinck into marrying him. She has no say in the matter, and he doesn't love her. He's only using her for his aristocratic ambition of taking over the next kingdom. We know the farm boy Wesley is good. He started off in the farm tending sheep and loved Princess Buttercup, and we know that is a bond that will never be broken. So even when he shows up as the dread pirate Roberts, we know that inside he is still the farm boy, and he still loves Buttercup as much as she loves him. You have other outsized kind of characters like the giant and the midget, and these circus type characters are just rank and file of characters that show up in a romance. You have stock scenes that you'll recognize. Tests of wit are characteristic element in this kind of a story. There are riddles to be solved. Tests of strength with the giant. You have the sword fight with Inigo Montoya, who also is on a quest for the six-fingered man who killed his father. So these are all elements that we recognize, along with stock events like the kidnapping of Buttercup and the aristocratic plots of the evil prince. Another thing that to point out with this movie is the negotiation that happens at the beginning between the grandson and his grandfather, who's coming over to read him this story. And the grandson says, well, I don't want a kissing story. And the grandfather says, no, it's not just a love story. There's love in it, but it's not just a love story. It's got all kinds of other stuff. It's got sword fights. It's got, great big evil eels that will eat humans. It's got kidnappings. It's got all kinds of the kind of things that the boy would like. And this is the larger R romance that includes a love story with all of these other elements. Now, this sets the stage. This is the first genre when writers started writing in sentence prose narrative in English, and pressures will develop as far as how this genre changes in future. Like, for example, how did the romance come to mean a woman's love story? Because that's not what it was in its sort of initial ancient form when writers were developing the elements of this kind of story. What happened to turn it into a woman's love story? How did romantic characters like this end up becoming more ordinary people, which is what we recognize in novels that we read today? How did that happen? I will, in our next webinar, start that phase of the story of what happens to genres as storytelling goes on over time in the English language and produces new genres. So if you have any questions that you would like me to anticipate and answer in my next webinars, I'd love to hear from you, and you can send your questions or comments through my contact page, and I will incorporate them into future webinars. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the next time.